Hello, everybody. Good evening to those of you in Israel. Good afternoon to those in North America. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center in Jerusalem. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to another of our Zoom conversations. We've been doing these for several years now, but we've now embarked on a sort of series related to the war, and specifically related to the most recent episode of the war, which is the Iranian operation, of course. We're going to be talking today about really one of the most crucial elements of Israel's foreign relations and security policy, not just in the context of this war, but in the Israeli broader historical context, which is its relationship with the United States. And we're really delighted to have with us one of the, I think, top Israeli observers, analysts, writers on this topic, Professor Jonathan Rynhold, who I will introduce momentarily. I'll just say that I'm going to be speaking to Professor Rynhold for about half an hour or so, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to put your questions in the chat. If you write the questions in the chat at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I will select some of those to put to him. Jonathan Rynhold is the head of the Department of Political Studies and a senior researcher at the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University. He also established the Jonathan Sachs Institute at Bar-Ilan University and is its first academic director. His research focuses on US-Israel relations. He's authored more than 20 academic publications on every aspect of that relationship. And he wrote a critically acclaimed book, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture, which won the Israeli Association for Political Science annual book prize. He was also involved several years ago in combating the academic boycott of Israel, very important issue as well. Jonathan Rynhold, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think somewhat indicative of the rather unpredictable nature of things since Donald Trump returned to the White House in many ways is that when you and I were first in touch about doing this, it was just after the president had returned from the Gulf, and my thinking was that we would be talking about the somewhat controversial things that came from that, the sort of lavish praise that he gave to Qatar, the ceasefire agreement with the Houthis, and I think there was a deal with the Saudis which removed, if I recall, it removed the Israeli element from that deal which had been in place, which the Biden administration had put in. And so I was thinking, oh, we're going to be talking about how maybe things aren't looking so rosy with the relationship. And then, of course, since then, we've had the Iranian operation, very strong American support culminating in that unprecedented American involvement in the war, the bombing of the Fordo reactor. So my opening question, which could have a lengthy answer, so please do, which is really, what's your assessment of what's been going on this past 2 or 3 months with the US-Israel relationship, with Trump and Netanyahu, of course, but also more broadly?
Well, thanks for that question, Paul. I think we do have to take a broader view. And I think the central question which you touched on is, how can it be, on the one hand, that Donald Trump can be the person who bombs the Fordo reactor, which Israel has wanted the US to do for at least 20 years? Yeah. And on the other hand, be the person who cuts a separate deal with the Houthis, a ceasefire that doesn't involve Israel, who moves to advance relations in the Gulf without having any connection to relations with Israel, and who moves in Syria in a way that Israel feels is problematic and is uncoordinated, and praising Erdogan, who calls what's going on in Gaza a genocide, praises him and says, yeah, I'll be fantastic at looking after Syria. So how can these things stick together? So there are two parts to the answer. One is to understand that Donald Trump actually has certain consistent instincts in foreign policy that are part of a longer tradition in American foreign policy that we can call either nationalist populist or, as it was called in the 1930s, belligerent isolationism. Um, in the 1930s, there were a group of Republicans who supported isolationism. And they were associated with the America First movement. Donald Trump did not invent the phrase America First. America First was the calling card of isolationists. What does it mean to be an isolationist? Well, it doesn't mean that you don't want to get involved in other countries and relations with them. What it means is you don't want to commit to the security of other countries, which means that you look upon alliance commitments as a burden rather than a boon. Instead of saying the more friends we have, the less we have to do ourselves. The more friends we have, the further away our enemies are from us. And that's what every president since Pearl Harbor, apart from Donald Trump, has believed. Or you can say the less we're committed to other countries, the less resources we have to waste on protecting those other countries. And that's what the isolationists believed in the 1930s. Now, why belligerent isolationist? Well, there were left-wing isolationists who believed that America, for moral reasons, either shouldn't get involved in foreign wars, it shouldn't, pacifist thinking, or who felt that by building up a military industrial complex, it would compromise America's democracy. But on the right, there were isolationists who felt that if a foreign power killed an American citizen or threatened the American homeland, then you use massive force against them. And if they threaten a friendly country, well, that's the problem of the friendly country. They're the ones that have to deal with it. Now, after Pearl Harbor, these belligerent isolationists remained belligerent. They very much supported dropping the bomb on Japan in order to prevent American soldiers dying trying to capture Japan. But on the other hand, right, and they also became in favor of preemption. That is, we're not going to wait for another Pearl Harbor. We're going to do it to you before you do it to us. And so after 9/11, you had George W. Bush, who says basically, I'm not going to wait around for Saddam to get nuclear weapons. We're going to go over there, yeah, and we're going to make sure he doesn't have them. Now, the second part of the Bush doctrine was to democratize these countries, but that wasn't the tradition of belligerent isolationism, and it's not Donald Trump. So Donald Trump retains the preemption. He retains the idea that you only act to protect the American homeland or to protect American citizens and not others. So, how can we see this in the context of Israel and the Middle East? Well, in 2019, um, the Houthis, working for the Iranians, bombed a Saudi oil refinery and cut their production by at least 30%. Under normal circumstances, almost any American administration would have responded with force. The Trump administration did not. However, when one American contractor was killed in Iraq, the Trump administration killed the head of the Al-Quds Brigade of the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. When American soldiers were fighting in Afghanistan, and a brigade of, a small number of American soldiers were in a difficult position against some Taliban, Donald Trump used America's largest conventional bomb, the Moab, the mother of all bombs, right? Which has the power of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, just to clear the way for a few soldiers so they wouldn't be in danger. So he's prepared to use massive force to protect America. So how does this relate to Israel today? Well, when it's the Houthis, when it's Syria, when it's the Gulf, I look after number one. I look after America, right? The Houthis, they don't really pose a major threat to the US directly. What goes on in Syria doesn't really pose a threat directly to the US. However, the Iranian nuclear program is different. A report that came out in towards the end of May, an intelligence report that was surprisingly made public, said that the American intelligence services, and Israel agrees with this, um, reached the conclusion that Iran is developing intercontinental ballistic missiles and that by 2035, they will be able to hit America with a number of intercontinental ballistic missiles that can carry a nuclear warhead. And it was also reported in the Times of London on Sunday that this is understood by the British Secret Service also to obviously include Britain in that. Now, we think of this war as a window of opportunity for Israel to act before Iran becomes nuclear. But if you're Donald Trump and you see down the line a direct threat to America, you also have a window of opportunity, right? And your window of opportunity, if you want to stop Iran being able to threaten the US directly, yeah, you need to act now in this window before they go nuclear, because afterwards, yeah, bombing Iran to stop missiles is a very dangerous thing to do, right? So when Bibi Netanyahu is supposed to have said to Donald Trump, "Do you want to be the president on whose watch Iran goes nuclear?" Yeah, of course, he was appealing to the president's narcissistic ego, but he was also appealing to a real American interest. And I think it's significant that it wasn't just Donald Trump who wanted to do this. It was also the head of America's Central Command, that's the command, military command for the Middle East, Mike Kurilla, and the head of the CIA. And what they said is that yes, yes, all right, maybe Khamenei hasn't made the final decision to actually press the button to say we've got a bomb. But in terms of American football, Iran's nuclear program is on the 1 yard line. And you don't go to the 1 yard line if you haven't decided to score a touchdown. And by the time you do decide, it'll be too late to stop them because they're already so close. So there was an agreement that America's vital interests were at stake here. Now, the other part of this, I said there were two things, is the internal element within the administration, within the Republican Party. So there are two approaches in the Republican Party. That which is actually internationalist, and that's like the Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor Marco Rubio and the head of the CIA. And on the other hand, you have the more MAGA isolationist wing. Yeah, so that would be the Vice President Vance, and even to a much greater degree, the commentator Tucker Carlson. And these people were saying, we're going to get involved in a major war with Iran. It's going to escalate. It's endless wars. We don't want another Afghanistan. We don't want to spend trillions of dollars and have large numbers of American soldiers dying for nothing. So when Israel effectively answered this by destroying Iran's air defenses, by being far more successful than even Israel thought it would be, and completely clearing the way for the American bombers so that they were taking a minimal risk. In other words, they were almost taking no risk whatsoever. Then it was an easy call for Trump because he had an answer to those people in the Republican Party who say, you're going to drag us into a major war. And the answer was, Israel's already done 90% of this. We just have to walk in and drop a couple of bombs, right? And so that explains how and why Trump decided to act as he did. If it's a direct threat to America, and if the costs are low, and on the other hand, the glory, the personal glory, right, that he loves to take, being a narcissist, is high. He knows Israel's already done all the hard stuff. Then it's an easy decision. When it's to do with other issues that don't directly affect America, then, Israel's on its own.
Do you think that there's a notable difference from Trump's first term when it seemed like, for example, um, the evangelical base of the Republican Party had a very strong influence on things like moving the embassy. The vice president Pence was obviously an evangelical, and a lot of Trump's um, pro-Israel rhetoric seemed to come straight from that wing of the GOP. Do you think it's significantly different this time around?
It is significantly different, and it's for the following reason. An American president, at least one that acts in line with the Constitution, can only be president for 2 terms. So during the first administration, Donald Trump, who wanted to get re-elected, needed to retain the support of the evangelicals. So if you look about when he decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem, when the ceremony was held, the main speaker was not a rabbi, it was a pastor. And in fact, it was a pastor who'd said anti-Semitic things in the past. So, this really wasn't anything to do with American Jewry. It was very much to do with evangelicals. And of course, now that he doesn't need to get re-elected, evangelicals are much less important to him. However, they still play a role because within the Republican Party and in Congress, lots of people need to get re-elected. So, in the midterms, all of the House of Representatives, and a third of the Senate has to get re-elected. And for Donald Trump to do anything, he needs to pass a budget in Congress. And so those senators and those congressmen retain a sensitivity to evangelicals that President Trump doesn't directly, but he still needs Congress, so he's still got to be a little bit careful. Not as much, but he's still got to be careful. But even then, um, even in the first term, if you look at what Trump gives Israel, it's always things that do not involve a commitment to Israeli security. Okay? So he gives Israel symbolic things. I recognize this, I recognize that. Does not upgrade the strategic relationship. Okay? Certainly the Abraham Accords are very significant, but even there, as opposed to the Biden administration and previous administrations, Trump did not upgrade the strategic relationship with the UAE or Morocco. Okay, he gave them like a super duper title of like extra partner, but with no extra legal commitments, which is very, very different from what America's done every other time that Israel's made peace with Egypt and with Jordan and even other partial agreements that have come along the way. So even then, that element was there. And you can see that in both administrations, he's spoken that, aid to Israel should become a loan, right? He doesn't support aid. He doesn't want to actually give material resources and security commitments to Israel.
Many people would say that his greatest contribution to Israel, like real substantive contribution to Israel in his first term, was in brokering the Abraham Accords. And he, of course, takes a lot of credit for that and has spoken about, as has Netanyahu, of course, about expanding it. And, the whole talk about Saudi normalization has been on the table a long time and was then suddenly stopped after October 7th, which, as we now know, was part of Hamas's intention, was to block the talk of normalization. But clearly Trump would love to help that to come along. And do you see his push, which has really been there from day one of this administration, for a ceasefire in Gaza, do you see that in the context of the wider picture of Saudi normalization and helping to and him being the president who sort of creates a new Middle East?
Um, I want to speak about that, but I just want to go back a little bit
Mm.
on the Abraham Accords. So the Abraham Accords do not begin with Donald Trump. They begin with the Arab Spring in 2011. It's then that the Arab countries come to Israel and say, we want to normalize relations. It'd never been that way around before. And they do so because they don't trust Obama to look after them. Egypt's gone over to the Muslim Brotherhood, and Syria's in the middle of a civil war. So they're the only country that's acting against those that threaten them, which is Iran and its allies, is Israel in Syria. And in 2014, immediately following the Gaza war, yeah, in 2014, the Saudis come to Israel and say, we want to do a peace deal. And the agreement is more or less in place. The Mossad does the negotiations, but Bibi doesn't move forward for political reasons, with opposition within the Likud to the terms of the deal. And the same thing happens in 2015. But a little known fact is that in 2016, at the very, very end of the Obama administration, there was a peace conference boycotted by Israel in Paris. And at that conference, the Americans negotiated with the Saudis a kind of final declarations, which the Saudis acceded to, which recognized Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So, yes, Trump deserves credit, right? For sure. There are certain things he did that no other president would have done. So, he recognized Western Sahara as part of Morocco. No other American president would have done that to get the deal because international law and America's view of international law say that isn't the case. Donald Trump, being an isolationist, couldn't care less about international law, said, right, do it. So he deserves credit for that stuff. How does that look going forward now? Yes, Donald Trump wants to expand the Abraham Accords. He wants to do so for two reasons. One, egotistical and narcissistic. And two, and this is something which him and Biden agree on, and that is the more America's allies can do in the Middle East, the less America has to do in the Middle East. For Donald Trump, that means just partial withdrawal. For Joe Biden, it meant, well, now I've got more resources to deal with Russia and China. Okay. But it's the same idea. And so that is also something that fits in strategically. And the more he can normalize relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the less chance of trouble breaking out, which would require American interference. So he really wants that to happen, right? Um, Now, Gaza for him is a local thing. That anything involving the Gulf, right, which is about 30% of the world's energy flows out of that area, that's of global significance, right? And there's no way of avoiding that. So I think what Donald Trump wants to do now is lever the sense that Netanyahu owes him, yeah, on Iran, to push for a ceasefire, which involves less than the complete and utter defeat of Hamas, but will probably have to give Netanyahu enough that he could go to an election in Israel if the far right bring him down and have a good selling point. And there's no doubt that what happened in Iran has softened Hamas's stance. There are reports coming out that they're willing to accept an Israeli presence um, on the border with Egypt, and there doesn't need to be a full withdrawal in the interim. There's still a major stumbling block, which is, is this a end of the war or is it a 60-day ceasefire? And that's a difficult one to square. That has always been the issue. But I think Trump would like to lever that and then, to Israel will mutter something about a Palestinian state. And then you can bring in other actors into the Abraham Accords. And, for Trump, that's great. And for Netanyahu, that's great. It looks good. He's got to have elections before October 26. If the far right bring him down, he's in power until the election. And if he'll be thinking if lots and lots of good things can happen between now and then that maybe that's my best chance. Or he'll just, if nothing happens, Trump's already said, he's marvelous, he's amazing, he's agreed to everything I've said. So he'll be covered on that side of things, and he can say, I showed you what a wonderful diplomat and strategist I am.
It's an interesting relationship, Trump and Netanyahu, because in the first term they seemed very close, and then there was the famous expletive about Trump, about Bibi, because Trump was upset that Bibi praised, sorry, not praised, but congratulated Biden's election victory. He even claimed that Bibi was one of the first, which I think wasn't true, but Trump saw it that way, and if I recall from I think it was Barak Ravid, the Israeli journalist that wrote about this. There were actually a number of occasions, especially during the Abraham Accord times, when Trump and Jared Kushner were very unhappy with things that were going on, that the Israeli government were doing. So, and since then, we now see what seems like, again, a very close relationship between the two, albeit with the occasional sort of rant about things that Israel's doing that he doesn't like. For example, when he said that both Iran and Israel, I don't know what the F they're doing, upset about Israel responding to the ceasefire, after the ceasefire had been given with a missile attack on Iran. So how do you see that relationship? And also, I mean, if I could just throw in as well, the extremely controversial recent tweets or Truth Social remarks by Trump supporting Netanyahu against his trial, was calling for his trial to be revoked.
Right. Okay. So I think there's three things here. Number one is the public and politicians themselves think personal relationships are much more important than they really are. And what do I mean by that is, if you look through the documents and the memoirs of every prime minister and every president, you'll find loads of stories like this. There's nothing unique. The only thing that's unique is that Trump says it out loud. That is unique, right? Otherwise, it's not unique. The second thing is, the real thing that's important is not whether they like one another, because it's business. They're like two mafia leaders, right? It's all about business. You know how the mafia works? If they want to pressure you, they buy you a present and then you owe them. That's what Donald Trump does. He says something nice about you, he does something, and then he owes you. So Donald Trump's statements about other people or about policy issues are nothing to do with what he thinks should happen, and everything to do with how I can get leverage over you and pressure you to do whatever it is I'm about to decide later on I want you to do, right? Because he only decides things at the last minute. He's a very, very skilled negotiator, but he doesn't have a clear idea of policy. Very, very vague direction,
It's
but
instinctual.
instinctive. Yeah, it's instinctive, a clear line, right? Deciding at the last minute, nothing wrong with that in general, but he doesn't really develop a clear thought about, what does it mean to stop Iran? At a certain point, he hooked onto enrichment. And this is the third point that's important. Why did he hook onto enrichment? He did that because what is really special is that Israel has access to the president. In other words, you know, advisors to the president always want the office next to the president, even though it's a crummy office and even though it's small, because you've got access to the president. It's the same at number 10 Downing Street, right? And what Bibi has either directly and Israeli prime ministers in general have with American presidents, or indirectly through like Ron Dermer or one of his advisors, is they can go and they can sit with the president and they can influence the president. And so if you imagine a world in which, Donald Trump's got Carilla and Rubio in one ear, and the head of CIA, and Vance and others in the other ear saying, don't do it. And in comes Ron Dermer or Bibi with all this intelligence information from Israel, right? That corroborates the Carilla CIA view, right? And then Israel acts in a way to prove things, right? And remember, Israel has much better human intelligence in the Middle East than the Americans. The Americans don't really have people on the ground in Iran, as you now know. Israel has plenty. And so that really gives you influence, right? That really is the access has been critical. It was that was critical in the run up to the Six-Day War with President Johnson. That was a critical. It was critical in 1973 with Kissinger and the Yom Kippur War. It was critical over Israeli nuclear weapons when Golda Meir went for a walk with Richard Nixon in the White House gardens. They couldn't talk in his office because, of course, he bugged it. Um, but so that is really important. So I would say, you know, not to put too much on the personal relationship. A nice word from Donald Trump is the equivalent to a promissory note that runs out in 24 hours. Just because he said something nice today doesn't mean tomorrow he won't say the exact opposite thing. It all depends what he wants from you at a particular time. Similarly, with the intervention in Israeli politics, the Americans have many times tried to intervene in Israeli elections in various ways. The difference is they've never done so bluntly, publicly, and tried to overrule the Israeli legal system. So, as normal, Trump is far more public, far wilder than other politicians, but he's not on another planet. He's just playing, a rougher version of the same game.
That's really interesting. Okay, I have one more question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. I'm going to encourage people to write their questions into the chat. Netanyahu's due in Washington next week, I believe. What would you imagine is going to come out of that meeting? What's going to be the headlines after that meeting, do you think?
I don't know what's going to come out of it, but I can tell you what's going to go into it.
Okay.
Israel will be concerned that the Trump administration will be focused just on enrichment. Okay. And enrichment, if Iran can't enrich on its own soil, that meets the minimal Israeli line for a deal. Okay. Israel would like the complete dismantlement, which happened in Libya, and but it can live with enrichment so long as, right, there is IAEA oversight and in inspections. Now, there's a slight issue there as to whether Donald Trump will be up for that because he won't want America to do it. But if it's the IAEA, he might be, I think he'll be okay. The other issue is that from Israel's point of view, Iran isn't just an existential threat because of its nuclear weapons, but also its massive production of precision missiles. That it was trying to build an arsenal that in 2 years would have reached 8,000 missiles. So if you imagine 8,000 missiles, right? So say 10% get through, which is, I think, more or less what happened, right? So 10% is of 8,000, yeah, is 80. Okay. 80 missiles, right, could decimate Israel. 80 large, I mean, it could knock out the whole of Tel Aviv, whole of Haifa. Yeah. Because however good your defense system is, it can't get everything. Will your aeroplanes be able to take off? Yeah. So while Trump obviously will look at the ICBM bit, right? The long range missile production, Israel will be trying to say, no, you've got to think about all the missiles. So that will be a thing. And the third thing will be Israel won't want Trump to um, get rid of the sanctions, yeah, unless both of those conditions are met. Because there's a chance to which Trump might say, look, I've done the nuclear deal, we destroyed it, now they're not going to enrich. But if they can build up their missiles, right, then at the moment, if Israel wants to attack those missile bases and production sites, it can. But if Donald Trump felt that to do so would endanger an agreement that he made over enrichment with Iran, that's a very dangerous situation for Israel. So I think those will be the issues at stake. The other issues will be, the extent of normalization, the conditions of normalization, and the ceasefire that have been in the media. But I think the much more deeper and deeply significant ones that, for this are really on those type of issues.
Mm. Okay, thank you very much. There's a question we've had from one of our audience about American action in Iran that says that basically that the questioner states that it was a half-baked job on Fordo, that they didn't destroy it entirely, it's being redeveloped, and that America didn't do a good, effectively didn't do a good enough job on that. So firstly, do you agree with that premise? But also, if I can add to that, what do you make of the different, what seem to be somewhat different messages coming out of America and Israel about after so you had Trump and Hegseth saying it was completely obliterated, and you got more nuanced messaging from Israel.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the American attacks were half-baked, and I wouldn't say that it was all about Fordow. Um, Isfahan was also very important.
Mm.
The way to think about this is, look, I'm sure it would have been better if they would have done another round and destroyed it altogether, right? That, yeah, I don't think anyone would argue with that. But let's just focus on what's happened. Um, what Israel's saying is if you think about a nuclear weapon, the way to think about it is in terms of a bus that has to go from point A to point Z to point Z. And if the bus doesn't reach any of those stops on the way, it can't get to point Z. What do I mean? The focus of those that say it didn't do that much is that Iran can probably start enriching a little bit of uranium again, if it really wants to, within a few months. But that's only the first bus stop, right? Okay. And even then, the bus is now only got three wheels. So it's going a lot slower because the destruction of the amount of centrifuges and the type of centrifuges means that that's a very long and involved process. So even on that, it's much slower. But then there are other elements like the destruction completely of their weaponization part, that part of the program that converts refined uranium into a metal to be put into a warhead. Okay, that's completely destroyed. Then there's the killing of all the um, 16 scientists and the IRCG people who run the program. And then there are many other elements which are probably too technical to go into, but you have to convert uranium, into a gas, and then you have to convert it back into a solid form. There's all these things. And when you hit lots of these different points, suddenly the Iranians have to get all these different parts that are not easy to get. They have to get them all again. They have to put the whole thing together again. They have to have the people with the know-how to do all of that. They've lost a lot of their archives, right, that were also destroyed. So the Israeli assessment is a cautious assessment is 2 years. But the real issue here is that Donald Trump said something important, and he said, if we need to, we'll do it again. That's critical, right? Because at the end of the day, of course, anyone can do it again, if you're willing to put all those resources into it. But if you know that at least for the next 3 years, America has a president who will either let the Israelis or the Israelis will attack again, right? That's a pretty good deterrent, right? Now, another factor here is that Iran has invested between the nuclear program and its so-called Ring of Fire strategy in Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza, and the billions and billions of dollars. And for an economy in which, a quarter of the population is probably unemployed, which inflation is running at 40%, and which the regime has been embarrassed by its failure to protect people, if they start investing and is under heavy sanctions, all in that, without investing in rebuilding people's houses, helping them with the economy, then once the memory of Israel's direct attack fades, people may well go out onto the streets, right? And there may even be a split in the regime between those who think the best way for the regime to survive is by rebuilding the program, doubling down, and those who think, well, we actually now have to show our people that we care, otherwise we're gonna lose here. We're gonna have something that explodes on us that we can't control. So I think all of that needs to be factored in.
Right. Okay, thank you. There's a really good question here about something we haven't touched on, which is American public opinion, which I know is something you've written a lot about in relation to Israel. And the question actually claims that public opinion seems not to have favored the American bombing in Iran. So firstly, I guess do you agree with that? But also, if so, will that influence future military actions by the United States towards Iran?
So, it all depends on the order you ask the questions, never mind which questions you ask. If you say, does America have to stop Iran having a bomb? Yes. Do you support America bombing Iran? No. So, look, with public opinion, there's hard and there's soft, okay?
Mm,
And there's support and accept. So clearly, the bombing of Iran was not an issue that got Americans out onto the streets, right? It just wasn't. It's not the priority. The priority is domestic things. So, yeah, maybe a majority of people didn't think it was a good idea, but they weren't hardened in their opposition. Democrats, yes, a majority of Democrats. So that's the first thing. Public opinion, you have to pay attention to how strong, how deeply felt it is. And you also have to say, who do politicians listen to? So for Trump, he's mainly listening to Republicans, and Republicans was different. So yeah, they were divided, but they think he did a good job overall. Going forward, um, the fact that this didn't lead to a regional war, and the fact that even if it only puts Iran back a year, right? It's not got America involved in some kind of massive war like Afghanistan and Iraq
mm,
because its objective is narrow. The objective was, yeah, to prevent Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state. It succeeded. It was not trying to turn Iran into a democracy. It did not involve thousands of American troops invading another country. It did not cost a fortune, and another country did most of the fighting,
mm,
right? And that is a lot cheaper, by the way, even when you give Israel a lot of aid, as far, far cheaper than using your own troops. Never mind putting their lives in danger, and
mm,
never mind the fact they probably were technically unable to do it, right? So it's what that does is it doesn't change the opinion of Democrats who are very clearly against things. But what it means is going forward, those who argue that force needs to be used for a narrow military objective. Like if it needed to be used again, if Iran was doing this again, it would be much easier to make the case, right? You just say, look, it worked last time. It was over in 24 hours. We'll do it again. And that's that, right? Um, so I think what it's done is it's helped those who will make the case in future if that needs to be done again, right? For a long time, America just hasn't been able to distinguish between different types of missions, right? You use military hardware to destroy military hardware, to use military hardware to change the political culture of another country. That's something different.
mm. Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, while we're on the subject of public opinion, because it's something that I know you've written a lot about, and the book that you wrote that I mentioned when I introduced you was a lot about that. What do you make of the direction of travel in terms of American public opinion in Israel? Because clearly, it's not news to anyone on this Zoom call. I suspect that in the Democratic Party, there's been a clear decline in support for Israel. Can you speak to that and maybe how that has been affected by this war? I don't mean Iran. I mean the war that started on October 7th.
Yeah. So until about 2015, however critical Democrats were of Israeli policy, like on settlements or its use of force, right? However the critical they were on that, when you ask them, do you sympathize more with the Israelis or the Palestinians? Or do you have a favorable view of Israel or the Palestinian Authority? 3-1 in favor of Israel. And it actually went up between 2004 and 2014. Nowhere near as much as it did among Republicans, right? But it did go up. So the debate in the Democratic Party was over Israeli policy, not support for Israel per se. Okay? And Joe Biden is a good example of that, right? Um, in the last decade, three things have come together to change that. And we now have the younger generation, the under 35s, on the left of the Democratic Party. So the Democrats are basically half left liberals, yeah, and half moderates. So the mainstream liberals, like, are okay. They're not pro-Israel, they're not anti-Israel. The moderates remain pro-Israel. And the left is not only pro-Palestinian but anti-Israel, right? So liberals would like to say that they're pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, and I'm sure they sincerely believe it, right? But for the quarter of the Democratic Party that's more like the European left, they are anti-Israel. So what's gone on there? Well, three things. Number one, the younger generations of Americans are far more sensitized by woke and race issues. That means they tend to see the world in terms of the strong and the weak. And they tend to identify the strong and the weak, which is a European way of looking at left and right and a Marxist way, yeah, in terms of color and not in terms of income or property. So Israel is white in inverted commas. Israel is strong. Israel is wrong. And with everything that's happened in America with Black Lives Matter and all of that, and that happening at the same time as three wars in Gaza, right? The Ferguson, Missouri, and the Gaza war in 2014 are very close to each other. That made it easier for Israel's enemies to make that connection, right? And to make people who know absolutely nothing about Israel and the Middle East think of Israel as white Trump supporters, yeah, and white Southerners, and the Palestinians as the blacks who were oppressed in America. The second factor is they get their news, younger people, from social media much more than from newspapers. And social media is global. And social media, the balance of opinion in the main platforms is like 2-1 against Israel because it's international. The next factor is that Netanyahu in 2015, in the way that he opposed the Iran deal, did so in a way that made Democrats see him as supporting the Republicans. So instead of like working with both parties, he worked with the Republican opposition to Obama in Congress, even though he needed 13 Democratic senators, and he had them at the beginning, but he lost them, or rather, Obama won them. And because that was a high-profile issue, where normally Israel isn't. So normally the fact that Bibi has favored the Republicans for 30 years never occurred to most Democrats in America. But when it's the number one issue in American politics and on your screen, that goes in. And between February and April 2015, you can see a clear drop in support for Israel that is exactly in parallel with the drop in support for Netanyahu among Democrats. And the third factor is, as we have had a purely right wing coalition with a large number of Orthodox and ultra Orthodox members for a decade. And at that same time, the younger generation of Americans are more secular and more left wing than all their predecessors. And so, if you're young, you have never known an Israel without a purely right wing government and a religious government and one headed by Netanyahu. If you're older, you're less affected by the Gaza war because you remember other prime ministers, right? Or you remember that Tzipi Livni or Ehud Barak was in the government, or you remember, that Israel withdrew from Gaza. Or you remember other things. But the combination of those three things all happening at the same time has caused the switch. It can improve, but only to a degree. So some of this is now hardened. You can think of it as a cake that's baked and can't be unbaked. But some of it is still Lego. It can be undone. You can take it apart. And we know this because the polling shows that, a majority of young Americans think that Jews are part of a white oppressing race. And I say Jews, right? Not just Israelis. And the and the Palestinian grievances justify what happened on October the 7th. At the same time, a large amount of that same generation think Israel has a right to exist as the homeland of the Jewish people and that Israel has the right to hit civilians in Gaza so long as it warns them in advance and so long as it doesn't target them. So there's obviously a lot of confusion and ignorance, but even allowing for that, there is now a clear body of young Democrats who are hostile to Israel, hostile to the idea of a Jewish state, and who consciously or unconsciously have anti-Semitic attitudes, things to do with Jewish conspiracies and double standards. That the elder generation doesn't have. And this is the first time since 1945 that younger people have held more anti-Semitic attitudes in America than older people.
Wow. Well, that's something. Do you think it makes a difference what direction the Democratic Party goes in more broadly? So in the aftermath of the election defeat, there's a question of what's the response going to be of the Democratic Party? Are they going to say, well, it's because we were too associated with the progressives and the woke agenda, therefore we need to move to the center, or is it we should double down on progressive and move to the left and forget Israel just on broader issues? Is that if, for example, they went in the former direction more towards the center, could that affect the sort of Israel issue as well?
Yeah, so the Democrats are pretty much divided down the middle. In terms of public opinion. But again, here it's sort of what's the depth of feeling? And unfortunately for us, the young people who are more active in the Democratic Party, not the older people, right? The younger generation, the lower ranks and the activists, there are many more of them on the left of the party than on the center, in the center.
Who voted for Zoran Mamdani in New York, for example?
Yes, yes. And that is an issue. But if you think about it, I'll take, since you and I come from England, I'll use a British metaphor, and that is the Labour Party was unelectable for a long time, precisely because most of its activists were on the left. And it was said of their 1983 election manifesto, it was the longest suicide note in political history. It took a long time, right? From 1979 to 1996 or seven, was it? I can't remember. Wherever Tony Blair, 97, when Tony Blair came in. And Tony Blair represented the centrists. And he said, look, only I can win, right? Only I can win. And at the moment, the way American politics works is it's about getting your base out and not winning over the middle. And that's what helps extremists in both parties, right? Because of the way the American political system works. But it may well be that if the Democratic Party takes enough punishment, that the American Tony Blair or the next Bill Clinton comes along. And those people tend to see Israel. You look at Clinton's comments in his new book, he's got all guns for Israel in this war. I mean, he's blaming
Mm,
Arafat. He's all out, no messing around.
mm,
And Hillary Clinton, exactly the same. They tend to see Israel as like a bellwether, as a sign of like, are you are you and the children of light or the children of darkness? In other words, we're talking about people who'll be, everyone will in the Democrats will be against settlements. Everyone will want a two-state solution. But when it comes to who are the good guys and who are the bad guys and defending the good guys, yeah, those are the moderates. Right now, they are not the force in the party, right?
mm.
They aren't. But, if you lose enough times,
Yeah, that's the lesson from the British Labour Party. Okay, well, Jonathan Rynhold, thank you so much for that and for really giving us such a broad sweep of the landscape of where things stand. I think it's really useful to get beyond some of the headlines and also I think some of the more partisan stuff that you hear on both sides about this issue, and it was really really useful. So thank you so much for joining
thank you,
us, and
Paul.
thank you everyone for joining. I can tell you we have another Zoom discussion next Monday, and that's with the security correspondent, the Jerusalem Post, Yonah Jeremy Bob, about the specific military actions that Israel took, not just in the operation of the last month, but also over the last several years with the Mossad sabotage operations and other things. So please join me for that. You can find the information on our website and our Facebook page, and you can email me at Paul G at Begin-Sadat.org.il if you want to join our mailing list. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again to Jonathan Rynhold. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.